What if I told you that one of the smartest Christians who ever lived looked into the future, into your future, and what he saw terrified him? Not war, not persecution, not some dramatic collapse of civilization. He was terrified of something quieter than that, something that would slip into the church wearing a friendly face, something so ordinary that almost nobody would notice it happening until it was too late. His name was C.S. Lewis. And before you decide this is just another history lesson, I need you to understand something. What he warned about is not something that might happen. It is happening right now, today, in your own life, and by the end of this video, you're going to see it in places you never expected. Stay with me until the end, because the last part of this warning is the part almost no one talks about, and it is the part that changes everything. Most people know C.S. Lewis as the man who wrote about a wardrobe that leads to a magical, snow-covered land. Children grow up loving his stories without ever knowing the man behind them, spent years as a convinced atheist, a soldier who watched friends die in the trenches of the First World War, a brilliant Oxford scholar who thought faith was a fairy tale for people who couldn't handle the truth. That is what makes what happened next so strange. This hardened skeptic, this man who mocked belief, ended up becoming one of the most convincing defenders of Christian faith in the modern world. He did not get there through blind emotion. He got there by thinking his way through every objection he could find and refusing to stop until he had either destroyed his faith completely or discovered it was actually true. When he finally gave in, he described it almost like a surrender, like a man cornered with nowhere left to run. And once he crossed that line, he spent the rest of his life trying to warn others about the very thing that had almost kept him from crossing it in the first place. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Lewis did not spend his time warning people about obvious evil. He was not worried about the person who robs a bank or the criminal on the news. He said something that should stop you in your tracks if you really think about it. The most effective way to destroy a soul is not through some dramatic fall into wickedness. It is through a slow, quiet, comfortable drift. He put it in words that have haunted readers for 80 years, and I want you to actually sit with this for a second instead of letting it pass by. He said the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. No dramatic moment, no obvious crossroads, just a slow, easy decline, so smooth that the person walking it never even notices they are moving at all. Think about that for a second. He is not describing someone who chooses evil. He is describing someone who simply never chooses anything. Someone who drifts, someone who is busy, distracted, comfortable, and never actually stops to ask where their life is actually heading. Now here is the part that should genuinely disturb you if you call yourself a Christian. Lewis was not describing outsiders when he wrote this. He was describing believers, church-going, Bible-reading, prayer-saying believers who had somehow convinced themselves they were fine because they were not doing anything obviously wrong. In his imagination, he wrote an entire book from the perspective of a senior demon training a junior demon on exactly how to destroy a human soul. And one of the very first lessons that senior demon teaches is this: do not bother trying to make the man commit some huge dramatic sin. That is too risky. It might wake him up. Instead, distract him. Keep him comfortable. Keep him busy with small, meaningless things. Let him go to church out of habit rather than hunger. Let him pray in a way that feels like a checklist rather than a conversation. Let him mistake feeling spiritual for actually being transformed, because a soul that is slowly going numb, slowly drifting, slowly losing its hunger for God is far easier to capture than a soul that consciously and dramatically rebels. If that made you a little uneasy, good, because we are only getting started. And the next part connects this warning directly to the world you are living in right now, in a way that Lewis himself could never have imagined, but somehow seemed to predict anyway. Lewis died decades before smartphones, before social media, before algorithms that can predict what you want to watch, before you even know you want it. And yet when you actually study what he warned about, it reads like he had a preview of exactly where things were heading. He warned that the enemy of the soul does not need you to reject God loudly. He just needs you distracted. He needs your attention scattered across 1,000 tiny things so that it never settles long enough on the one thing that actually matters. Now stop and think about your own daily life for a second. How many hours do you spend scrolling through a feed that was built by some of the smartest engineers on the planet, specifically designed to keep your eyes locked on a screen for as long as possible? How many notifications interrupt your day, each one pulling your attention away from anything deep, anything still, anything that requires more than 6 seconds of focus? Lewis warned about a slow drift away from what matters, and we built machines that are engineered, quite literally engineered by teams of psychologists and data scientists, to produce exactly that drift on purpose every single day in the palm of your hand. Here is the uncomfortable question you need to ask yourself right now. When was the last time you sat in complete silence, without a screen, without noise, and actually let your mind settle long enough to ask yourself hard questions about your own soul? If you cannot remember, that is not an accident. That is the gradual road Lewis described. Except now it comes with push notifications, and it does not stop at simple distraction. There is a second tactic hiding underneath the first one, and it is even harder to notice. It is the slow replacement of real reflection with the appearance of reflection. Think about how much of modern life is built around performing a version of yourself for other people to see. A carefully chosen photo, a caption written to sound a certain way, a public version of your faith, your opinions, your struggles, all curated for an audience instead of lived out quietly before God. Lewis warned about a kind of pride that convinces a person their own image of themselves matters more than the truth of who they actually are. And an entire generation now has tools that make constructing that image easier than it has ever been in human history. You can spend so much energy managing how your life looks that you have nothing left over for actually examining how your life is. That is not an accident either. That is the same gentle slope wearing a filter. There is a third tactic, quieter still, and it might be the most relevant one for how you are feeling right at this very moment. It is the slow erosion of your ability to sit with anything difficult for more than a few seconds. Every algorithmically designed feed you scroll through trains your brain to expect constant novelty, constant stimulation, constant movement to the next thing. Over time, that training does not stay contained inside your phone. It bleeds into your prayer life, which starts to feel unbearably slow. It bleeds into reading anything longer than a few paragraphs, which starts to feel unbearably demanding. It bleeds into your patience with people, with silence, with waiting on God for an answer that does not arrive on your preferred timeline. Lewis warned about a soul slowly losing its appetite for anything real and lasting, replaced by an appetite for anything quick and stimulating. And he did not need to see a smartphone to understand exactly how that process works, because the mechanism is the same whether the distraction is a screen or a rumor or a hobby or an argument. The tool changes, the tactic never does. But this is where most people stop the analysis, and that is exactly the mistake, because the warning goes even deeper than distraction. And this next part is the piece almost nobody connects to Lewis, even though he wrote about it directly. Lewis believed that one of the most dangerous states a person could be in was not doubt, and it was not even outright disbelief. It was false confidence. He believed there was a particular kind of person who was in more spiritual danger than the obvious sinner, and that was the person who was nice, respectable, kind to their neighbors, reasonably moral, the kind of person everyone at church points to and says, "What a good Christian family." Lewis said this kind of niceness can become one of the most effective disguises the enemy ever invented, because it convinces a person they have already arrived, that they are already good enough, that there is no more work to be done, no deeper surrender required. He argued that natural niceness, the kind you're simply born with or raised with, can actually stand in the way of the harder, deeper transformation that real faith requires. Because the nice person feels no need for grace. They feel no desperation, they feel finished, and a soul that feels finished stops seeking. Think about how radical that idea actually is. Lewis is saying that being a good person, in the shallow sense most of us think of it, can actually be a trap. Not because goodness is bad, but because it can become a substitute for the real thing. It can become a comfortable resting place instead of a launching point. And if that idea makes you defensive right now, sit with that feeling for just a second, because that defensiveness might be telling you something important. Now let's talk about the part of this warning that connects directly to the year you're living in. Because Lewis had a very specific fear about what happens to a culture that convinces itself it has moved beyond the need for absolute truth. In one of his sharpest and most prophetic works, Lewis argued that a society which stops believing in any fixed objective right and wrong does not become a society of freedom. It becomes a society of control. Because once you remove any shared standard of what is actually true and good, someone still has to decide what counts as acceptable behavior, what counts as speech, what counts as morality. And when that decision is no longer anchored to something higher than human preference, it gets handed over to whoever has the most power to enforce their preferences on everyone else. Lewis was warning, decades in advance, about a world where morality becomes whatever the loudest, most powerful voices decide it should be in any given moment. Shifting with culture, shifting with trends, shifting with whoever controls the platforms where those trends are decided. Does any of that sound familiar in the world you live in right now? A world where what is considered acceptable to say or believe seems to shift dramatically every few years, where entire institutions can reverse a moral position that was considered unquestionable a decade earlier. Lewis did not predict specific events. He predicted a pattern. And patterns, once you learn to see them, are very hard to unsee. Here is where I need you to lean in, because this next section is the turning point of everything we have talked about so far. And it is where the warning stops being about the world out there and becomes something entirely personal. Picture an average Christian living in 2026. Not a villain, not someone who has rejected their faith, just an ordinary believer. They still say they believe in God. They still show up to church most Sundays, or at least most of the Sundays they are not too tired, too busy, or too behind on sleep from staying up late scrolling. They would still tell you, if you asked them directly, that their faith matters to them. But if you actually looked at how they spend their attention across an average week, the picture looks very different. Hours go to entertainment. Hours go to work and stress and trying to keep up financially. Minutes, sometimes just minutes, go to anything resembling real prayer or real reflection. They are not rebelling against God. They have simply drifted, gently, gradually, without ever making a single dramatic decision to walk away. And that is exactly, precisely, word for word, the danger Lewis described almost a century ago. No sudden turnings, no milestones, no signposts, just a slow, easy decline, so smooth the person walking, it never even notices they are moving at all. Now ask yourself honestly, not for anyone else watching, just for yourself in this moment. Does that description sound like someone you know? Does it sound uncomfortably close to your own life? Because if there is even a small part of you that just felt a flicker of recognition, that flicker is worth paying attention to. That flicker might be the most important 30 seconds of your entire week. Here is something that most retellings of Lewis's warning completely leave out, and it might be the most important part of everything we have covered so far. Lewis did not just diagnose the problem, he lived it before his conversion. He was not living some obviously wicked life. He was, by most standards, a decent, intelligent, hard-working man. He was respected. He had close friends. He was not the kind of person anyone would point to and say, "There goes a man in spiritual danger." And yet he later described his own resistance to God not as some dramatic rebellion, but as a kind of quiet, stubborn, comfortable refusal to surrender the one thing he wanted to keep control over, himself. He described God's pursuit of him almost like being cornered by something relentless, something that would not let him keep hiding behind intellectual arguments and busy distractions forever. He talked about finally admitting defeat, describing himself as the most reluctant convert in all of England, dragged in kicking and struggling, looking in every direction for an escape. That is not the language of a man who found faith easy or automatic. That is the language of a man who understood exactly how strong the pull of comfortable drift really is, because he had felt that pull himself, right up until the moment he stopped running from it. This matters because it means the warning is not coming from someone who never struggled, lecturing from a place of easy certainty. It is coming from a man who knew firsthand exactly how convincing the comfortable lie can be. And that is precisely why he spent the rest of his life trying to wake other people up before it was too late for them, the way it almost was for him. Before we get to the final piece of this warning, I want to show you a story Lewis once imagined, because it might be the single clearest picture of everything we have talked about so far. And once you hear it, you will not be able to unsee it in your own life. He imagined a group of ghostly souls being given the chance to leave the gray, dull, half-real place they had been drifting through, and step into something real, something solid, something overwhelmingly good and alive. One by one, they are met by people who love them, who plead with them, who offer them exactly what they claim to have wanted their entire existence, and one by one, most of them refuse. Not because the offer is unclear, not because they are forced to stay, they refuse because accepting would mean giving something up. One clings to bitterness because being right about an old grievance feels more important than being free of it. One clings to a reputation because being seen as impressive feels safer than being truly known. One clings to endless self-pity because it has become the only identity they have left. Every single one of them is given a real, genuine, open door out of their grey, drifting existence, and almost every single one of them chooses to walk back through it, back into the fog, back into the familiar, comfortable, undramatic nothing they already know. Lewis was not describing people who were dragged into misery against their will. He was describing people who preferred it, quietly, reasonably, one small, unremarkable choice at a time, right up until preferring it became the only thing they knew how to do. Now hold that image next to your own life for a second. How many small, undramatic, perfectly reasonable choices have you made this month that, if you are honest, were really just you choosing the familiar fog over the harder, realer thing? Choosing the scroll over the silence, choosing the grievance over the forgiveness, choosing the comfortable version of yourself over the version that would actually have to change. None of those choices feel dramatic in the moment. That is exactly the point. That is exactly the mechanism Lewis kept trying to describe from every possible angle, because he knew that if he could just get people to see the pattern clearly enough, some of them might actually choose differently the next time it showed up, disguised as something small and harmless. So let's bring all of this together, because now you have every piece you need to understand the full weight of this warning. And I promise you this next part is worth waiting for. The chilling truth Lewis was trying to communicate is not that hell is full of obvious monsters who chose evil in some dramatic, cinematic moment. It is that hell, according to his understanding, could be full of perfectly nice, perfectly respectable, perfectly busy people who never did one single dramatic wrong thing in their entire lives. People who simply never stopped long enough to actually decide anything at all. People who let their days get eaten by distraction, their convictions softened by comfort, their moral compass quietly outsourced to whatever culture told them was acceptable this year. People who called themselves Christians, who would have been offended if you suggested otherwise, but whose actual daily attention, actual daily surrender, actual daily hunger for God had been slowly, gently, gradually drained away by 1,000 tiny choices that each felt too small to matter. That is the warning. Not a warning about sudden catastrophic sin, a warning about drift, a warning about comfort mistaken for faithfulness, a warning about niceness mistaken for holiness, a warning about a culture that keeps redefining truth mistaken for moral progress, and a warning about attention, your attention being captured by forces that have far more resources and far more precision than anything Lewis could have imagined when he first put these ideas on paper, yet somehow described with frightening accuracy anyway. Here is the part almost nobody says out loud, so I'm going to say it directly to you right now. If you are still watching this far into the video, some part of you already knows this warning applies to you, not because you are doing something obviously terrible, precisely because you are not, precisely because your life looks fine from the outside, precisely because if someone audited your life for evidence of wrongdoing, they would find very little. That is exactly the profile Lewis was most worried about, not the dramatic sinner, the drifting believer, the comfortable Christian, the nice person who never quite gets around to real surrender because real surrender never feels urgent when everything looks fine. So what do you actually do with this? Because a warning without a response is just anxiety, and that is not what this is for. The first thing Lewis would tell you, if he were somehow able to speak directly to you right now, is to stop mistaking activity for depth. Going to church is not the same as encountering God. Reading a verse is not the same as letting it interrupt your life. Feeling spiritual for a moment is not the same as being spiritually alive. He would tell you to actually examine, honestly and without flinching, Where your attention goes when nobody is checking. Not where you wish it went, where it actually goes. Because that, more than any statement of belief you could recite, reveals what you actually worship. The second thing he would tell you is to stop trusting your own niceness as evidence that you are fine. Kindness is good. Respectability is good. But neither one is a substitute for actual surrender, actual transformation, actual ongoing hunger for something beyond yourself. If your faith feels comfortable, finished, settled in a way that requires nothing further from you, that comfort itself should be a warning sign, not a reassurance. The third thing he would tell you is to guard your attention like it is the most valuable thing you own, because it is. Every minute handed over to mindless distraction is a minute that could have gone toward stillness, toward honest reflection, toward an actual relationship with God, instead of a performance of one. In a world engineered to fragment your focus into 6-second intervals, choosing to protect longer, slower, quieter attention is not a small thing. It is an act of resistance. And the fourth thing, the one Lewis returned to again and again throughout his writing, is this. Do not wait for a dramatic moment to make a decision, because dramatic moments are exactly what the gradual road is designed to avoid. If you are waiting for some clear, obvious crossroads before you take your faith seriously, you may wait your entire life and never receive one, because the whole danger of the gentle slope is that it never announces itself. The decision has to be made now, today, in this ordinary, undramatic moment, precisely because it does not feel urgent. That is the trap. The lack of urgency is the urgency. I want you to think back to that image Lewis gave us. The gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. Now, I want you to ask yourself, honestly, right now, before you close this video, and let your attention drift to whatever comes next. Which direction is your slope actually pointing? Not where you hope it's pointing, not where you'd say it's pointing if someone asked you at church. Where is it actually pointing? Based on how you have spent your attention, your time, your convictions over the last 30 days. Because that is the real audit. That is the question Lewis spent his entire life trying to get people to actually sit with, instead of avoiding. Here's the last piece of this warning, and it is the piece that turns everything we have talked about from an interesting historical idea into something that matters for the rest of your life. Lewis believed that every single day, every ordinary, undramatic day, is quietly moving you in one direction or the other, toward greater surrender, greater attention, greater hunger for what is true and eternal, or toward greater drift, greater distraction, greater comfort with a version of faith that costs you nothing and therefore changes nothing. There is no neutral gear, there is no pause button. The slope is always moving, even when it feels like nothing is happening at all, and especially when it feels like nothing is happening at all. That stillness, that sense that everything is fine and nothing needs to change today, is precisely the sensation Lewis said should worry you the most. So here is where I leave you, because the rest of this decision does not belong in a video. It belongs in your own life, starting the next time you put your phone down, the next time you sit in silence, the next time you have the chance to choose depth over distraction and have to decide, quietly, with nobody watching, which one you actually want. Lewis did not write his warning to frighten people for no reason. He wrote it because he believed, having lived through the danger of comfortable drift himself, that the people most at risk are never the ones who think they are at risk. They are the ones who feel completely, comfortably fine. If this made you a little uncomfortable, do not push that feeling away. Sit with it for a minute after this video ends. Ask yourself honestly which direction your slope has actually been pointing lately. Because according to the man who wrote one of the most convincing warnings in modern Christian thought, that quiet, uncomfortable question, the one you're tempted to scroll past right now, might be the single most important thing you do all day.